Well, let's get some more on this now with Joshua Mahony, who's Chief Market Analyst at Scope Markets. Welcome back to the show, Josh. Good to see you. So what are your thoughts on why China's exports grew faster than expected last month?
Well, great news for China, certainly when it comes to exports. That's exactly what they want to be focusing on. The weakness in terms of the import side of things, less of a concern at the moment. Part of this comes down to what you can call base effects, which essentially means what's the comparison to where we were a year ago. And a year ago, we saw a particularly poor figure. And so it wasn't necessarily too difficult to see a beat this time around. But certainly there's some grounds for encouragement, in particular when it comes to their trade within the Asian region, up 9.7%. And in actual fact, you know, there's been big question marks about the relations between China and the US, China and the EU, especially with the question marks around tariffs for automobiles in particular. But we did see some weakness on that side in terms of the US, just 0.2% growth in terms of exports. EU minus 3.9. So really we're seeing some strains further abroad, but within the Asian region, really China is powering forward.
OK, and looking now at the domestic situation in China, what do these numbers tell us about the health of China's economy and especially this new industrial push for manufacturing that the government is very keen on?
Well, from an internal side of things, you know, this is particularly interesting because anyone that follows China has known for years the focus has been on gain a really strong domestic base, and you won't necessarily be reliant on foreign countries who, as we've seen with the likes of the EU and the likes of the US, you know, can impose tariffs. Donald Trump potentially coming in later in the year, and that doesn't necessarily bode too well, given anyone that has a memory of the 4 years of Trump being in power will know that we spent pretty much the whole time talking about a breakdown in US and China relations. So the weak imports number will be a bit of a concern. The IMF recently upgraded the GDP estimates for this year on the expectation that they're going to see a strong rebound in terms of domestic consumption, and certainly the imports number would point towards that not necessarily being the case at the moment. But from the sort of domestic manufacturing side of things, certainly things are working out very well as it stands, and certainly the strength of the Chinese EV market in particular is particularly notable as they plan to likely roll out their products across the globe and continue to push into areas that typically have been dominated by European and US companies.
So a really strong EV market. China's economic data has been mixed though, hasn't it, over the past few months. What's your reading of what's behind the lower imports into China? You know, is it all about lower domestic demand? What's behind that? Is it, you know, the property sector? And what's your outlook for the coming months?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, you know, we have a similar kind of situation here in the UK where everyone's money is tied up within the real estate sector. And when you see weakness within that area, people become quite fearful and withdrawn in terms of the purchases when it comes to big ticket items. So it's not necessarily a shock, the fact that we're seeing these major jitters within the real estate and housing sector within China, and that impacting the domestic demand situation. Retail sales suffering recently. The latest numbers that we've seen certainly pointed towards retail sales as being the one area of weakness. And we saw, say, industrial production doing particularly well, fixed asset investment relatively elevated. So the domestic demand picture remains questionable. That is all tied into the credit issues, the real estate issues. But, you know, ultimately there is a view that give it a little bit of time and these things will be worked out. And when you've got the strong export side of things, then, you know, you just need the sort of domestic consumption thing to tie into it. And suddenly you're looking at a particularly strong China going forward.
Yeah, certainly no denying those really strong export numbers. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. Joshua Mahony from Scope Markets. Appreciate your time.